Decades before the Salem witch trials, we had the Pendle witch trials here in the UK. Not many people know the story, but it's just filled with tragedy and evil. It's so sad. So everything happened after one particular incident in 1612. There's a family called the Devises, and one of the teenage daughters, called Alison Devis, was walking through a country path where she crossed a peddler, which is just basically a traveller. And this peddler was a man. Alison, coming from a poor family, was a beggar, so she asked him for some pins and the man just ignored her. She did this all the time and she was often ignored, outcast, and when the man didn't even acknowledge her, she cursed him out. Just moments after, the man fell to the floor and was unable to move his body, speak, move, and the left side of his face started to deform. It sounded like he had a stroke or an aneurysm, but back then it was definitely a sign of witchcraft. Alison was so terrified of her own talents here that she just ran away, and the man was quickly found by other villagers and taken to an alehouse where he received treatment. After a few days, he did start speaking and regain consciousness, and he described the woman, and the locals knew who she was straight away, and they knew the family to be quite troublesome. The villagers then summoned Alison to basically beg for forgiveness, and she did. She was so sorry for what she'd done. Because she apologised, she was basically pleading guilty to witchcraft. The man did forgive her, but his family and the villagers didn't, and they went to their local magistrate, who was someone called Roger Knowles, who was a very nasty man. Roger Knowles wanted to appease the king and catch witches. James I wrote the book of demonology, and he was adamant that during the time of so much turbulence here in the UK between Catholics and Protestants, Protestants were pretty much the government, and Catholicism was seen as satanic and witch-like anyway. So James I wanted to catch anyone associated with the devil. So Roger Knowles, hearing there was a witch in one of his local towns, was set on sending them all to gallows. So here is where the trials began, and the villagers were more than happy to testify against Alison and her family. So Alison's family, again called the Devises, were led by a matriarch, someone called Granny Demdike, who was in her 80s, and they lived on a farm that is still standing today, the building, and there was many people there that lived there. They often held bonfires and gatherings within their family, but they also had a arch rivalry and friendship with another family called the Shattuckses, which was one of their neighbours. Now, when the Devises were accused of witchcraft, they immediately said, well, our neighbours are as well, it's not just us. And they all went to trial at Lancaster Castle. Testimonies apparently delivered so much evidence that the Devises and the Shattuckses, 11 people in total, were all pretty much deemed guilty of witches. And this evidence consisted of them being ginger, because, you know, that's a witch. Also them using herbs, owning multiple animals, including black cats, and apparently killing men. The conditions of prison in the 1600s were far from ideal, and Granny Demdike, being in her 80s, passed away. So now they thought there was only two people that they thought were the ringleaders of witchcraft. They were Annie Shattucks, which was the neighbour of the Devises, and the Devises' older daughter. Annie Shattucks pleaded guilty, and looking back at the trial, historians now believe that she pleaded guilty in the hopes that her daughters and the rest of her family would plead innocent. She was in her 80s and she thought her life was the better one to go, in a better way to put it. But unfortunately, that didn't work. Now, the oldest daughter from the Devises was called Elizabeth Devis, and when she stood to trial, they brought out a key witness, and that witness was her 9-year-old daughter, Janet Devis. As soon as Elizabeth saw her 9-year-old daughter, she started screaming, and the magistrates and the 10 men leading the trial quickly ushered her out of the building because her daughter wouldn't testify in her mother's presence. Janet was the sister of Alison, the girl that put the curse on the peddler at the beginning, and she saw how upset and terrified her sister was, and likely she was also upset by this. So she unwillingly ordered the death of the entire Devis family. The one testimony of a 9-year-old, they stood her on a table like she was an actress, and she accused her mother of turning into a dog, her granny making clay figures, murdering men that were killed decades ago. She also, very interestingly, brought up the name Alice Nutter, which no one from the Devises family knew. However, the magistrate Roger Knoll knew the name Alice Nutter very well. That's because he had a land feud with her. And little Janet, age 9, said, yes, my granny and my family knew Alice Nutter very well. She's also a witch. So she was also sentenced to death. Of the accused were 2 men and all the rest being women. A time where women were deemed to be part of Satan's posse, basically, that they lured men into seduction to entrap them so they couldn't fulfill their destinies. Blah, blah, blah. Now, in the town of Pendle, there's a hill called Gallows Hill, and the incline is pretty much that. It's a very hard hill to climb. They chained all 11 of the accused, forced them to walk up the hill while holding the gallows that they will later be hung on so they could repent. After the priest performed their last rites, they were forced to march back down the hill, and a day later they were all hung at Lancaster Castle again. Just 20 years later, after Janet accused her entire family of being witches, she herself was accused of the same crime and met the fatal end that her mother, her sister, and everybody else in her family did. You can go to Pendle. It's filled with witchy-themed pubs and shops, and you can do the walk that the witches did. It is a really lovely village to go to, and you can also see the grave of one of the witches. That's the story of the Pendle witch trials. Wild that so many people don't know about it, especially because it happened decades before the Salem witch trials. If you have any interesting stories you want to share, please DM me. Let me know your thoughts on this story.